Hey everyone, it's Erin. I am joined by Brandon. We are of Counter Read, a new newsletter that is all about Nebraska sports stories, well told. And we are here because we have just launched this YouTube channel because we also want to bring you, in this case, post-game reactions. And that is what we are going to bring to you right now. Brandon, it is late for you. It's almost midnight on the East Coast. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. So Nebraska just finished opening the Matt Rhule era. Unfortunately, I think for a lot of Husker fans, it felt pretty familiar. But that's kind of the interesting thing about it in my mind. So a lot to get into, a lot we won't get into specifically on this video, but will later at counterread.com. My question for you to kick things off, if you're scoring this on a 1 to 10 scale for the enjoyability, think of it as a music review of Matt Rule's debut. What number are you at?
Oh, so it's like the instead of the Taylor Swift era, which era it's the Matt Rule era, which how do I feel about it? I would say, and I you kind of gave me a heads up to think about what I would react with, and I settled fairly quickly on a 5 out of 10, which I think some people might think is too unfair or maybe too fair. I don't know. I kind of like it like right down the middle because I think I saw things that encouraged me. Like I felt encouraged by some moments, and then I felt really discouraged by others. And so I'm kind of right on that midline right now where it was neither a greatest hit, but it wasn't a complete flop either. So it was for me 5 out of 10. So now I know you have an answer, and I'm curious what it is.
Well, I will tell you up until the Anthony Grant fumble in the fourth quarter, which I think in my view ended up swinging this game. I was at a 10 of 10.
Oh,
I really was. It was a hideous football game. Aesthetically, it was not enjoyable. But it looked to that point like somehow Nebraska was going to come out of this, the type of game it has lost over and over again and ended up losing again this time. And just it was going to get a win. That would have represented a kind of sea change from where things had been. And like it was clear to me that both teams in this game, I think, have some weaknesses, have some flaws. It's also week one, which must be noted always. Um, but it took Nebraska finding a way to win this game for me to get there. That they didn't, that all the kind of familiar pain, I think, of recent Nebraska seasons probably came back for some people in this one. I'm at a 6 of 10
okay.
because I still think there's some encouraging things about this, though I want to be clear. Like it's very clear Nebraska has some limitations, but in my own weird way, when I look at this, I'm kind of like, it's a game they probably should have won, but didn't, which is a unfortunately familiar story.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about what encouraged me, I feel like if you're walking away from this and you're looking for some positives, the defense is one where I think you've got to feel pretty good about what Tony White did with that defense. I mean, it's not perfect, but I mean, when you talk about what we are looking at it as a defense in 2022, it is very night and day different. I that was one where I felt really good about that. And yeah, the defense had some, key moments where I'm sure they would have liked things back or to have done things differently. But overall, I thought they played well enough for Nebraska to win. The thing that you pointed out in your game notes, which again, if you are watching this, head to counterread.com and make sure you're subscribed so that you get all of this to your inbox. We have both free and a paid subscription. But the big thing that a lot of people have been talking about is turnovers and limiting that. And the turnover bug just continues to plague Nebraska. It just seems to be kind of a wash, rinse, repeat type of deal where it doesn't really matter who the quarterback is, who isn't. It's just a situation that continues to plague Nebraska. And I don't think it's a jinxed situation. I just think, unfortunately, these are the players that, whether it's previous coaching or the coaching they have received now, I'm not sure, but it is a continuous issue that Nebraska runs into is turnovers. And unfortunately, Jeff Sims showed a lot of what we'd seen at Georgia Tech, which didn't seem to concern Matt Rhule too much, at least what he said publicly. But that's not a great sign right now, where you're going to definitely need to be working on ball security and better decision making before you head to Colorado in a little over a week.
Yeah, through a lot of off platform balls, which was interesting. His first interception in the first half was kind of like a good play by a really good player for Minnesota. Kind of say tip your hat on that one. The play right before halftime felt huge because at that point, Nebraska at worst was going to tie the game going into halftime, having possessed the ball for just a fraction of the first 30 minutes. And they didn't because of an interception. It's the third turnover that really sticks out to me because as this game went on, Anthony Grant, who, in the week leading up to this game, we learned was probably third on the depth chart at running back. And the sole issue was, Matt Rhule said this, his propensity to fumble. And as I was watching this unfold, Nebraska was up 10-3. I'm like, their primary ball carrier is the guy that the coach just said last Friday, if he fumbles too much for us to put him at the top of the depth chart, and you get a fumble, it kind of flips the game. Thanks to a really amazing catch by a Minnesota wide receiver that tied this game at 10-10. Statistically speaking, which is how I tend to speak a lot of the time, turnovers are worth about 5 points. Nebraska is -2 in this. Like, if you're looking for a reason to be encouraged, and I have quite a few actually, you're -2, so that's -10 points based on national averages over many, many years. You lose by 3. Like, I understand it hurts. I understand it feels reminiscent of the Scott Frost era at Nebraska. You could walk away from this game and be like, well, nothing's different. I get that piece of it, but the way that I look at these things, I'm like, well, you were -2 in turnovers and you lost on a last second field goal. One of the keys that I mentioned in the preview on counterread.com was, can one of these teams end up +1 in made field goals? That was Minnesota. They won. Nebraska basically negated the time of possession. Tackles for loss, I thought they needed to get to 6. They were at 5, which was the same amount that Minnesota had. I mean, this game was just a ugly, messy toss-up game. But there were some good things that Nebraska did, and there were also some clear signs of, I think, their limitations currently. That said, it's the first game out of 12, so they've got time to work on some of those things.
Yeah, and that's the thing I would say. I'm not ready to overreact too much to what we saw just because of that very fact that it's game 1 out of 12. It's also the very first game of the Matt Rhule era. And I think when I said 5 out of 10, that was why it was there, is because I'm like, it's not a flop and it's not a success. It's kind of just it's just there. And, when we look at Matt Rhule's first season at Temple or his first season at Baylor, they weren't these like shining gems of seasons, but they were foundational. They were stepping stones to what would become more successful seasons for Temple and Baylor. And so some of it is too, I think, and I've had this conversation with people prior to now, and one of the things I have really truly believed is going to be one of the bigger hurdles that Matt Rhule and his staff have to overcome is honestly the mental side of this. Nebraska doesn't know how to win and hasn't known how to win in a very long time. And I'm not going to say that is everything, but that is something. If you are a team that is constantly put in situations where you're having to basically fight tooth and nail for every inch to get a win, and you don't have a lot of experience on the winning side of that, it's going to be harder to overcome. I really do believe that that's true. I won't bring up former coaches' names on this very first episode of this on a post-game show, but I have thoughts about the ways some things have gone at former schools where coaches had success, but I'm like, those teams knew how to win. They had success coming to Nebraska. This is a team that hasn't been to a bowl game since 2016. It has been a while. So you get these one-off wins, but I just don't think it's enough to build consistency on. So honestly, had Nebraska won tonight, had Nebraska gotten out of Minnesota with the win, I still wouldn't have felt like there was a lot of momentum behind that, because it just would still be, they've got to keep piecing these things together, because this is a team that I think truly likes each other, respects one another, wants to play with one another. But I also don't think this is a team that knows how to kind of solve the emotional side of it at times when the going is getting a little too tough, and you've got to now just rely on the fundamentals, rely on your game, rely on what you know. It's what you practice, you perform. I just don't think Nebraska is there yet, and I've long felt like this is going to be one of the bigger hurdles that Matt Rhule and his staff is going to have to overcome, is the mental side of it, which doesn't work in stats. Because how do you quantify any of that? There's somebody who's going to watch this right now and be like, this whole thing is BS. And like, look, I can't argue with you because I can't quantify it. But I just think at some point this team needs to start winning consistently and winning those close games, because then they'll know how to do it when something gets tough like this. Unfortunately, I just don't think they're there yet.
Yeah, no, I think that is probably the hurdle. Like, it became apparent over, and I apologize, I have mentioned previous coaches on this video. But it became apparent during Nebraska's previous era that, like, in my opinion, the Huskers were just a team that was waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Yeah.
And how do you reverse that? And it was clear tonight that they didn't do it over the offseason, which I don't even know if it's fair to expect that to happen over one offseason. You might just need a game like this to go your way once, to show those guys who, I mean, Nebraska fell to 2-14 in one score games since 2021, which I know is like a stat nobody wants to hear anymore, but it is what it is. And until you get to three wins, like, it's going to continue to just be out there. And you can't measure that piece of it. Some of the things you can, I think, are really encouraging. When Nebraska turns the page to Colorado, they won success rate, which is, just a measure of how often the team stays on schedule. It's just probably the most important stat in football. It won the explosive play battle. You do those two things alone, you win probably 85% of the time, unless, you're -2 in turnovers, because those are worth about 5 points each. And that's how it went down. So it is, but you kind of had the perfect setup here of Matt Rhule all in the entire lead up to this game, talked about, we want to win in the fourth quarter, and they didn't. They got outscored 3-0 in the fourth quarter, and that's the difference.
And it looked like it was going a little bit differently in the fourth quarter. In fact, like at one point, it felt like Nebraska was going to win the fourth quarter. And I do think, I don't want to like get too ahead of myself here, but after, talking with Matt Rhule and having him say, like, when things get tough, everyone's looking and going, are we going to be okay? And he's just going, just play the next quarter. Like, I do think that Matt Rhule has the right, like, perspective on everything. And I think that he will, it's even how he talked about the kicking situation. And when the media, when we ask him about, like, would you put a kicker out there to make a game-winning field goal or to put them in a high pressure situation, he's like, why would I not? Like, I don't want them thinking about those things. I want them to just do their job. And I think he's got the right perspective of, like, I just want them to do their jobs, and I don't want them to be overthinking everything all the time. So he's got the right mindset. Like, I do think he's in the right mindset of that, but it's now you've got to get that, like, holistically around the whole team. And again, there's people who are going to watch this and they're going to roll their eyes and go, I don't really care. It's this or that. It's this. And here's the thing. I don't actually think any of you would be inherently wrong. If you want to focus in on this one piece, whether it be Jeff Sims turnovers, or if you want to focus in on just like the fact that this team hasn't won consistently in a very long time. I mean, although you could technically say, Nebraska had won its last game, because the last game that it had played did win. It was a big win. But at the same time, that was a totally different season. It's kind of one of those things where I'm like, I am now going to be curious to see how Nebraska responds heading into Colorado week. I think that is actually going to say a lot about this team. It will say a lot about this coaching staff, and it's going to say a lot about what we can expect through the rest of this season. I made a comment in 2022 after the Northwestern loss. I said, Nebraska has told us who it is. So we need to trust them right now and believe that what we saw against Northwestern is what we will see throughout the season. I am not ready to say that yet after this in 2023 after Minnesota. I'm not ready to say the exact same thing. I don't think that this season necessarily will follow the trajectory of just this one game in quite the way I was certain of it 1 year ago. So for anyone who was keeping track of that when I said it last year, and you're like, why aren't you kind of taking that hardline stance now? It's because I actually do think the scenarios are fairly different. So I'm willing to still give it a little bit more time before I say one way or the other, this is how this season is going to end up.
Yep, which is kind of always, and I'm always worried that perhaps annoyingly so, my approach to any one game. Like they're all one of 12. And at the end of 12 is when well, it's when it stops. So that's when you know what you have. And I expect, and we're recording this early enough, we haven't heard anything that Coach Rhule or any of the players or anybody has said after this game. I expect them, and we'll see what Colorado looks like, in its opener under Deion Sanders this weekend at TCU. But based on this game, there are a lot of issues that I think became apparent. Some we could have foreseen. I would say the wide receiver group. Nebraska doesn't have it doesn't have the options I think it expected to have or wants there, and that's an issue. Jeff Sims with turnovers. Like at times he looked like Nebraska's best player, and at times he looked like a volatile player who could potentially hurt you in a game, which has been a quarterback tradition at Nebraska since about 2010. I think.
Mm-hmm.
I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not a lot. But I would expect Nebraska to go to Colorado and play well. Like I think there are things they can build on from this. I really really do. It was a tough result. At the end of the day, 5, 6, 7 months from now, like you'll look at this and just be like, yeah, lost 13-10 to Minnesota. That was a tough one, and it was tough. But
Well,
for where this program's at and where Matt Rhule needs them to be, like I think they will maximize this loss in a way that you couldn't at the point where you were talking about, Nebraska has shown us what they are. That was the start of year 5 for Scott Frost. And,
yes.
eventually you got to a point where it was just like, yeah, I don't see a way it's going to be different. It
Yeah.
wasn't different tonight, but it is game 1.
Well, I will say this, the one quote I've seen so far, and this is what you expect Matt Rhule to say, is that he did not envision the 7 penalties and the 4 turnovers. That is not what he thought that they would do. He thought it would be a close game, a battle. So got to address those little attentions to detail. So again, it'll be interesting now between now and Colorado. There's so much that we can dive into. There will be plenty to dive into. You should head to counterread.com, subscribe. Even if you sign up for the free newsletter right now, I'll give us the opportunity to earn your trust and just to kind of show you what we're about. This week, everything has been free, which is going to actually include a newsletter tomorrow being Friday. So make sure to go check that out. And then next week, we will always have free newsletters as well, so that you can just get an idea of what to expect and all of the good stuff that we will have. But we just believe in telling good stories, and we will continue to do that. Brandon will continue to dive into the numbers and everything else. Yeah, it's not how I hoped that we would record this video tonight, but honestly, it could have been far worse, which I know that doesn't make anyone feel better, but I think there's plenty to build off of. So now the question is, can Nebraska do it? And if they can't, we will have a very different conversation on one of these videos here in the near future.
Yeah, I mean, year 1s are always interesting. You get a little bit of a free roll, so to speak, but losing in kind of the way that Nebraska has lost so often so recently stings a little bit more. So certainly get that. But plenty of time to dive into some of those things in greater depth, and plan to do that in the week ahead.
Yes. So, Brandon, thank you. It is after midnight for you. We are going to go to bed, get some sleep. It's been a wild 72 hours, but we will be back with plenty more. Go to counterread.com. Be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Plenty more to come here, especially as we go forward. If there's anything that you feel is missing, especially in like the Nebraska media landscape when it comes to like your YouTube content, we'd always love to hear from you. Leave those comments or questions, whatever. But we will keep an eye out on the comment section if you do have questions. And as always, thanks for just being a part of what we are building. Again, Brandon, thank you. We will talk to you all later.
Thank you.